right. Welcome, everybody, to another seminar organized by the Abstraction Research Project and Research Group. Welcome to this new seminar. And we have the pleasure today of hosting a colleague from Germany that I have been collaborating with for a long time. We meet often on different occasions, at different conferences, and in different situations. One of the last times was in Oxford, I think.
Very true.
You were visiting. And so our guest today is Diego Frassinelli, who is a senior lecturer at the Center for Information and Language Processing at LMU, the University of Munich in Germany. Diego has had already a career in Germany, touching different universities there, but his PhD was obtained from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in computer sciences. And after that, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Natural Language Processing in Stuttgart with Sabine Schultenwalde and other dear colleagues. And then as a junior professor of AI at the University of Constance. And his research, Diego's research, is truly at the intersection between computer sciences, psycholinguistics, cognitive sciences, computational linguistics, theoretical linguistics, and multimodality. So I'm very, with a PhD in computer sciences, and then you collaborated also with Gabriella Vigliocco at UCL in London. So you touch on so many different disciplines that I think your profile is truly interdisciplinary, and your profile is truly at the intersection between all of these disciplines. And his most recent work focuses on multimodal figurative meaning in humans and machines, as well as on concreteness and other psycholinguistic semantic variables. And the methods you use are theoretical, empirical, and computational. So with all of this richness and variability of approaches and theoretical frameworks, I'm very curious to know more about today's seminar that has the title From Bananas to Justice, Modeling Abstractness Across Text and Images. So welcome everybody again, and join me to welcome Diego today.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you, Mariana, for the amazing introduction. Now I have a lot of pressure on me. And thanks for the invitation in general. It has been really amazing couple of days. So super nice talking to you guys. And yes, today we are going to talk about some of the work that we are doing in collaboration with Sabine Schultenwalde at the University of Stuttgart. And the topic is something that I believe somehow interests some of us in the room, that is talking about abstractness. So just to get the LLM out of the room, this presentation will not talk about LLMs. I will not show you results that LLMs can provide, how LLMs model concreteness and so on. We can talk about that another time. The only use of LLMs in this presentation is for the fun part. So generating some interesting images is always nice. So let's jump into actual topics here. So, well, it shouldn't be anything new in the slides. So abstractness is this very central concept in cognitive science. Levi-Barsalou, 2003, has this very interesting and very precise description of what abstractness is. But what is interesting in his work is the fact that he really highlights the fact that there is a lot of terminological ambiguity. It shows us that there are at least 6 different definitions of what abstractness is, going from relational, schematic, introspective meaning. So a really broad range, going from the more empirical type of measures, That is somehow what we are focusing on most of the time, but also a lot of philosophical ways of defining abstractness and what abstractness is. As I already said, our work always focuses on one definition of abstractness. Clearly, there is another one that maybe some of you are aware of. We will not talk about general versus specific here, even though that's another very interesting way of operationalizing somehow this dimension at the conceptual level. But in our case, we are really looking at the most traditional way of quantifying abstractness in terms of this dichotomy between concrete versus abstract, something that became even more famous with the big collection by Brisbert and colleagues in 2014, this large collection of norms. And also thanks to those norms, just this comparison, this definition became one of the most used in cognitive science, but most of all in computational linguistics. I would say that 90% of the work in computational linguistics works based on this type of definitions. So what is the core property here is, well, the idea of describing abstractness in terms of perceptual information. And here we already see a tiny example. So we see justice, happiness, and banana. And what makes justice more abstract than banana is the fact that banana is, I think, that is way more present in the real world in terms of perceptual type of properties. We will go back to this multiple times. So for now, just bear with me with this just definition, just a point to make. These little numbers in paddings are just concreteness scores. So here we are saying that justice is as a concreteness score of 1.5. We will see what that means. Very abstract. Banana instead has a concreteness score of 5. Very concrete. So now what do we mean by what is a concrete concept? Well, a concrete concept based on this type of definition, this operationalization, is a clear, perceivable referent, is a concept that has a clear, perceivable referent throughout the 5 senses. We can see them, we can hear them, we can touch them, so on and so forth. If you're looking at the type of concepts that land into the concreteness bucket, most of them are really categorized in terms of natural objects on one side, banana, versus artifacts, like chair, the things that are entities that we are experiencing in the real world, just natural versus created by humans. Those concrete concepts also have very defining properties. So the entities that are linked to those concepts are very defining properties. They have usually a very specific color, taste, sound, etc. So if we think about bananas, most of us would probably think about a yellow banana. Maybe someone would think about a green banana, but maybe not pink banana. A banana has a specific taste, a banana has a specific touch, feeling, a banana has a specific smell. And the banana potentially has a specific sound, maybe the sound of peeling a banana. And something important to keep in mind is also this idea that those properties that I just described, those perceptual properties, are most of the time shared across all of us. So we all more or less say, yeah, bananas yellow. So from a probabilistic perspective, from a statistical perspective, those characteristics are highly characterizing the specific entity because we are sharing, because they are available there. So we have these direct inputs from the reality. And of course, this makes our ability to assign those characteristics way easier. Those concrete concepts and the entities that are somehow linked to those concepts have also very clear interactions with other entities. We are, eating a banana with our mouth. We are maybe cutting a banana with a knife. And also very interesting, usually those concepts and those entities have clear situations. We probably expect to see a banana more frequently, more often in a kitchen than on Mars, at least for now. So these very classical situations where those entities occur more often. This doesn't mean that it don't occur anywhere else. But here, remember that we are always looking at some sort of most probable type of situations, colors, smells, and so on that we can capture. And last point here is this concreteness effect. Definition that nowadays we are taking a bit more carefully. There is nothing too strong available. You have shown some of the limitations behind this concreteness effect. But in general, I would say that still we can say that these concrete concepts seem to show this cognitive advantage, this idea that somehow they are recognized more accurately, they are recognized faster, there is more, a richer and more precise also contextual information that is linked to them. And nothing that is surprising based on what I just said. On the other side, we have our other guys. Abstract concepts, way more tricky to precisely define. Even something that in our different groups, we are discussing more and more often is this idea, can we even talk about abstract concepts as a thing, as a bucket? Or maybe should we be a bit more careful and think about more of this continuum idea? Because in a certain way, if you're looking at concrete guys, yeah, like somehow fit well all together, we see these very clear categories and so on. Here, way more difficult to put them in just one bucket. And as I'm saying this, I mean, it's still something that is really under discussion. I don't think that there is really a consensus at the moment yet. But I believe this is something that our community in general should discuss more and more just to figure out what's really going on among abstract concepts. Second point is this idea that, of course, abstract misses what concrete had. This idea of perceivable reference in the real world. Clearly, if I'm telling you, you know, think about joy, think about happiness, think about justice, you would create a mental representation of what joy is, and it would become very concrete in a certain way in your mind. But what is very interesting here, remember this idea of probabilities and, you know, statistical descriptions. Probably my way of imagining, for example, joy, probably very different from the way that Mariana thinks about joy. So it's very experiential, it's very linked to how we are interacting with the real world and how we are somehow conceptualizing this idea based on our experiences. And this is something also interesting that we see in our studies with concrete versus abstract, this idea of still linking back abstract concepts into the concreteness, certain amount of entities. So we need this concreteness layer in a certain way to situate in a certain way those concepts in our experience. But very different with also very other types of properties that are all emotions. So very interestingly, way more tricky. Other important thing, there is not really a clear categorization. Let's look at this example. So number versus joy. Very similar concreteness scores. So theoretically, should be the same. Are they? Clearly not. One emotional, one mathematical definition. Big question here. And you see, we will come back to this idea that in a certain way, a lot of our work, I'm expanding it to you and you can tell me if I'm wrong in looking at this. So we are assuming that those numerical definitions have a strong meaning. They're interpreting what concrete versus abstract is based on those numbers, those concreteness numbers, or on your generic versus specific type of definitions. But of course, those numbers hide a lot, and we can see it here. And in general, as we said, with the example of mental representations, those properties, interactions, and situations are way more difficult to retrieve. And in general, what we are missing is this general shared set of properties that we all agree are characterizing one of those concepts. So in general, still a lot of work to do. Fun part, I mean, we are researchers, so we don't like boring questions. And I think these, among the many questions that we can ask about concrete versus abstract, I think this is one of the interesting ones. And we should all, as a community, bang more on this name. Just to provide some terminological pointers, I will try to behave, but I will probably also mess it up at a certain point, so bear with me. In general, here we have concepts on one side, that is our mental representation, we have words, and remember in computational linguistics, in particular in the linguistic side of it, words is what we're actually analyzing, and try to draw conclusions about concepts based on distributions of words in text. And those are the corresponding linguistic surface forms. And then, given that this talk is about also vision and images, then we have those images, and those are visual representations of a concept. So how do I represent a banana versus how do I represent joy? And based on what we already discussed, you probably see where I'm going with this. So, first of all, well, the question, as we said, given that we are really relying on these little numbers to say something, or to say actually everything about concreteness in this type of framework, first of all, where are those scores? And those scores can come from different resources, but in general, the go-to place in 2026 is still concreteness norms. So those are just large collections of human judgments collected normally on crowdsource. The most famous collection is our Brisbane and colleagues, 2014. I will go back to it in a second. And these are very summarized. So I just extracted some elements from their very long and very detailed instructions. So I'm not saying that those are the full instructions. But here, the idea is we want you to indicate how concrete the meaning of each word is for you by using a 5-point rating scale going from abstract to concrete. And then what they show in their paper, in their instructions, sorry, for the humans, is this table. So they say we go from 1, abstract, we go to 5, concrete. And when we are, it's true, it's fine. But in a certain way, already in this image, there is something that, for me, it's a bit problematic. That is our definition of abstract. And some people are saying, yes, so I'm happy that this idea resonates. Can we really say, well, we can say, yes, concrete, experience-based, check, fits well with the narrative here. Saying that abstract is language-based, some issues there. Of course, we need language to describe it, but same in a certain way from the other side. But still, I mean, we also, the important thing to remember is that those collections also really try to get the spontaneous answer of humans, and probably they went here for the most obvious way and the most shared way of defining what is what, also to obtain some judgments that are really also based on personal judgments of our different subjects. And here we see again our justice and banana. So 1.5 justice and banana 5. So now those numbers should make a bit more sense to everybody. But where are they coming from? Well, they just come from averages. So here the collection by Brisbane and colleagues groups together 37,000 single words in English. There is also some multi-word information, and also this very nice new collection about only multi-words. So nice stuff there. But here what we focus on is single words, and in general they just ask at least 25 subjects to judge each of those concepts, each of those words at this point. And the 1.5 is this average of 25 scores. What are those norms in general? Well, what is important about them is this idea of operational definition. So they really give us this idea of what subjects intuitively say about those concepts. And 12 years after the creation of those norms, this is still the resource to go for a lot of our studies. Why? Well, it's big. So it's the largest collection, so 40,000 is a big number. And also because it has shown to be a relatively stable and a relatively good quality type of resource. And it really became this source of empirical measures for many fields. The two fields that we are most familiar with, while cognitive science and those scores have been used as predictors in many analyses targeting, memory, processing speed, and many others. Computational linguistics, well, in this case, again, as predictors for lexical behavior, semantic representations, at the more applicational, so applied perspective, concreteness is also very important when trying to model figurativeness. And based on what Mariana said about my work now, you also see where I'm going in a certain way. So concreteness is just one of those properties that are important to consider when looking at figurative meaning. And we did quite some work with Sabine also about what can we say? So what's the link between a metaphorical reading, for example, and concreteness information of the components? Not part of today's talk, however. Something also to consider about the computational linguistics, the computational linguistic usage is also the fact that the drawback, 40,000 is a lot for behavioral studies, maybe 40,000 is very little for computational studies. And that's where also, different groups are trying to see, can we predict those scores? Can we automatically generate them? Because clearly they are expensive to collect. Are we doing an excellent job? No, us included, but we are doing a fine enough job. And those scores are definitely useful, in my opinion, way more for the more automatic type of analysis more than for the interpretation, so the cognitive science type of analysis. And they really became this reference collection to automatically quantify abstractness in many studies. But there is always a but. And are we actually using them in the right way? And are we interpreting them in the right way? And this is going to be the first part of my talk. Basically, I will try to show you some studies that we conducted to show you that we're not putting our head of, we know it better than the community. That's not what we're after, but just some studies to show where somehow very often we're just maybe misusing those informations, those resources. So some issues that emerged. Here I start with a couple of general issues, and then I will show you some results that we obtained. First thing to consider is this average at word level. As I told you, the little number is an average of 25 scores. Good enough, many cases, averages, we like averages. But at the same time, in a moment where both computational cognitive science, but even more computational linguistics now really focuses, at least some of our community, on subjectivity, variability at the subject level. Talking about averages for very subjective, very human-like scores gets tricky. Second point, out of context. We all know it. I mean, context is the key element for disambiguation. Being context, even linguistic context, here we would be happy with that. If more situational, situations where those entity interacts. And sense variation is clearly one of the key problems there. When we see bank, which bank are we talking about? Money bank, river bank. But in reality, we know, or at least we guess, which bank it is. And this is thanks to frequency. I would guess that if I would ask you before, would have asked you before, what do we mean by bank? Most of you would have probably said money. Except if you just spend the last half an hour before coming to the room, to your riverbank, and at that point you will be probably primed to the oven. And again, this is the idea. So I have 25 scores. So on average, this is the most probable, the most expected type of sense representation we are touching to this word and to this concept. Guessing. The other problem that is crucial here is this idea of treating abstract as low concrete. As we said before, this idea of one single bucket catches it all. And here the point is probably we are hiding, we are missing some interesting characteristics of those concepts that are potentially way more interesting to describe and to analyze, but also more difficult to describe and analyze. And a couple of more. And those couple of more is actually what I want to focus on today. And this is the first one. Just to say very clearly, in this case, I'm not saying that the norms have problems. I'm just saying that the way that we are interpreting those norms, we're throwing meanings and interpretations attached to them, from time to time are just a bit too generous. And this is one of them. If I were asking a lot of people, also, people that did a lot of studies on concreteness and abstractness, they would say that this dimension is bimodal. We have a peak for concrete and a peak for abstract. And kind of not random people said that. So ratings of concreteness, abstractness were bimodally distributed in agreement with other studies. The distribution of concreteness ratings is bimodal with separate peaks for concrete and abstract words. This comes from the paper that described the norms. Because in a certain way, what we should be careful about is if I'm drawing some conclusions about bimodal distributions from a cognitive perspective, well, that's a different game. But if I'm drawing conclusions about bimodal distributions on the norms, well, it's easy to measure. Let's look into it. And this is what it is. So yeah, why not? We see those two peaks, a very higher peak for abstract, with lower peak for concrete. What does this plot shows us? On the x-axis, we have just concreteness scores going from 1 to 5. We will see why I'm binning them, but this idea is, we just look at bins at around 1, around 1.5, around 2, around 2.5, and so on and so forth, and just simple counting. How many words in Brisbane have a concreteness score of 1? How many, and so on. Apparently, yes, they are right. Ish. Let's look at this plot now. This is exactly the same data. So just to make it very clear, because otherwise you will tell me that I'm cheating here. So here we are looking at 26,000 words, only nouns, verbs, and adjectives. But believe me that even if I'm including all the words that are single words in Brisbane, the plot would be very similar. What would be the difference is that the central elements here would be a bit less bumpy, and the other difference is that abstract will go even higher in terms of counts. But given that I wanted you to see those bars, if I had a y-axis to a higher up, you would not see. But in general, this is the distribution that we see happening. What we did here was to look at part of speech. Can we just group our words based on their part of speech? Nouns, verbs, adjectives. Already we see some different things, a different story happening here. In particular, when we're looking at nouns, so red bars, we see these increase in a certain way of numbers of counts going toward concrete elements. In general, nouns are more concrete, not surprising, As we said, very linked to our experience and so on and so on. Not surprising. Let's look at verbs. Way more abstract. And yeah, we could start even asking, what does it mean to be concrete or abstract verb? different story. And here we see adjectives. Similar story for adjectives, they become even more abstract. Even more, what does it mean to be abstract or concrete for an adjective? And those are also the reasons why a lot of our work and in a lot of the work of other people, we see the focus on nouns. Why? Because in a certain way, we know probably too little about the other two classes, and we probably have some issues on their scoring. So in general, is this bimodal? Not really. And why is it important? Well, it's important because in computational linguistics, distributions is what make us model stuff, get specific results. And starting from specific assumptions that are not present in the data, or at least they are biased by other very obvious confounding elements. Part of speech is not tiny fact. It's something that we should really pay a bit more attention to. Second problem, second habit, the part on average ratings. So we said we often look at one value, an average value, out of 25 participants. So not a bad also sample size, the representative of what at least a subgroup of people would think what concreteness is and what is a concrete element of those elements of specific target. But the first question that we should ask is then, if we work with averages, the assumption is that most of the people agree on the average. If that's true, problem solved. We have one value, it's beautiful, it's easy to deal with, let's stick with it. Problem. So this is what our PhD student Urban called a croissant plot, and now our objective in life is to make those plots being called croissant plots. So here what we can see is on the x-axis, mean concreteness ratings, on the y-axis, standard deviations. So mean versus standard deviation. Each of those little blue things are referring to nouns in the Brisbane norms. And what we do here, we just, each of these dots is one concept, one word, one noun in the Brisbane collection. What do we see here is quite interesting. So what we see here is for the extremes, standard deviations are relatively low. For the middle values, standard deviations explode. Hold on a second, because otherwise the mathematician in the room or the person that understands number in the room will say, well, but isn't that obvious? Remember that this is a constrained distribution. We don't have values below 1 and we don't have values above 5. So of course, by design, the standard deviation of these extremes is going to be smaller than the standard deviation of the middle. But still, even assuming and accepting exactly this fact, still we have a problem. Or at least we have a characteristics that we should really include in our analysis. Look at these other guys. Verbs in orange, adjectives in green. Similar story. And even more, what we see here is exactly what we saw in the bar plot before. More abstract, so they're all a bit falling toward the one. But in general, very similar story. This croissant plot appearing over and over again. So this is a work that we did with Ban and Sabina in 2003, where we decided to say, okay, let's look at mid-values. So what are the characteristics of concepts with mid-scale ratings? So we said extremes seem to behave quite well. What happens in the middle, where the croissant becomes nice and fat? And this is the narrative that the point that we want to make. So here we see a bunch of examples. And what happens in the middle in a certain way for discussion and percentage is exactly what we want to analyze, because there is this problem that an average value of 3 can be the results of many things. Can be the results of the fact that we all agree that it's 3, and this is what the literature call a semi-property. Is this really abstract? No. Is this really concrete? Neither. It's a 3. Versus disagreement. I say that percentage is a 5. You say that is a 1. We average it together, we still get a 3. 2 threes, identical value, totally different ways of getting to that value. And that's what we're trying to really analyze here. So very different distributions, again, because in computational linguistics, especially those distributions play a massive role. So what we did was to focus on nouns only. We extracted them from the Brisbane norms, and we looked at 3 groups. So 500 extreme concrete, 500 extreme abstract, and then a mid-scale. What is mid-scale here? Those are scores that go from 2.9 to 3.31 concreteness scores. And then our 2 analyses, very simple methods, because what we are after here is not the complexity of the method, but try to see clear interpretations, hopefully. So we start with a classification task where we're looking at average scores for now, and then we will just look into clustering in order to look at really these subjectivity elements, so these individual elements, individual judgments that were provided. Because the good thing is that Matt Brisbane and colleagues, even though they release only the average scores, they can give you access to the full distribution. And that's something interesting. I mean, the fact is that most of us will still work with the averages because either you don't know that they are available or they're just there. So something to keep an eye on. So our first study number 1, we're just looking at what are the characteristics of these mid-scale elements. And here we built 3 super simple classifiers. Where what we are trying to predict is this word concrete? Is this word abstract? Is this word abstract or mid-scale? Is this word mid-scale or concrete? Super simple binary classification. What are the properties, the features of this classification? Again, super simple features taken from our literature. All elements that we know from the literature that have an effect or correlation somehow with concreteness in general. So we have the very cool Lancaster norms by Dermot, Lynott, et al. That look at these perceptual properties. So banana is a specific auditory score according to humans, a specific gustatory score. So is it more gustatory, is it more auditory, and so on and so forth. The NRC, the VAD lexicon, so valence, arousal, and dominance. We know the other collection from the same guys, Brisbane and colleagues, but I mean, very similar numbers here, just a bit larger. That's why we went for it. Then we extracted frequency of those words from the NCAL corpus, a large web corpus, and then the good old free word associations. So we look at the first most associated word to our target, the second most associated, the first 2, and the first 3 most associated word for each target. And what do I mean by those features is that we really look at, can I predict so can I discriminate concrete versus abstract based on valence, arousal, and dominance? Valence, arousal, dominance. So we run a lot of models here. Very simple, very tiny, because we wanted really to investigate the contribution of every single mod or every single feature toward this classification. Results here. So x-axis, we have the different features. So we start with the most perceptual features, so auditory, gustatory, haptic. Then we have valence, arousal, and dominance, frequency and ambiguity, and then the 3 association scores. Y-axis accuracy. We said is a classifier, so how many times do we get the right label? First of all, not a difficult task. In general, we were not expecting it to be difficult. That wasn't our objective. What is already interesting when we're looking at the first plot to the left, where we are comparing basically concrete versus abstract. So the two extreme cases. Here we see how, and that's nice to see, how haptic and visual, the two very, present type of perceptual properties are the ones that allow us to discriminate between the two. If there is a high visual load from the Lancaster norms, this means that probably that thing is concrete. If it's a low visual load, it's probably abstract. That's what happens here. But that wasn't an interesting bit in this study, more a sanity check. What is interesting instead is when we compare the two plots and how we can see that. So the plot on the right-hand side here, we are classifying mid versus concrete. So mid-scale versus extreme high-level concreteness. What can we see here? Extremely similar plots. Extremely similar. So what is up, higher up there is higher up here. Of course, we see a slight reduction in accuracy. Why? Well, because those entities, those elements that we're comparing now, they are becoming a bit more similar. But still, quite nice results. Mid versus abstract. Kaboom. Remember, this is a binary classification, so 50% is tossing a coin. That's where we are. So what we can say here by looking at these mid plots, this plot in the middle, is how a classifier based on those properties, or to rephrase it back, those properties are not good predictors to discriminate between abstract and mid-scale. So that was already one element to consider, that probably based on those features, there is really not much of a difference between what happens in mid-scale and what happens in abstract. Again, we said before this idea of continuum. So concrete seems to do its own business. Abstract and mid-scale, a bit more tricky. And again, if we want to use this classification, so if we want to classify those elements, this is something we should keep an eye on. So second study was a classic study. So now we just emailed Mark Boisbert and we said, please send us your individual ratings. And now what we're doing here, we are basically just focusing on the mid-scale. So now forget the extremes. We're just looking at the very center of the distribution. And we are representing each of those targets as a vector of 5 elements. And those 5 elements are basically the number of participants among 25. That said, definition is a 1, so it's very abstract. Definition is a 2, definition is a 3, definition is a 4, definition is a 5. So the intuition is that we are just representing those mid-scale elements as a distribution of the concreteness values that characterize them. Now we have a vector. So now the computational linguists are happy. Now we can do everything. And that's exactly what we did here. So we used k-mean clustering, so an idea of taking those vectors and see how they relate with each other. Do they group together in a meaningful way? Yeah. Actually, we can see that with a cluster size of 3, we see these very nice blocks, groups that don't overlap most of the time. So we see some slight overlap on the edges, but in general, they seem to behave quite well. What does this mean? Well, it means that the properties, so these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensional vectors, are different in a systematic way when looking at yellow, when you're looking at green, and when looking at blue. So then what we did was just to basically move forward and just look at what happens, what are the characteristics of those 3 clusters. So this metric shows us basically the 3 clusters, and then on the y-axis we see our concreteness scores, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the heat map here basically shows the average percentage of raters that gave a specific score. So here we see that in cluster 1, on average, participants gave 26% of the time a score of 1. 12% of the time, a score of 14. Among all the elements in, I don't remember the color, in black on the screen, it was pink or some sort of violet. In real life, same for green, same for yellow. Interestingly, look at those darker colors. We really see how those three groups, three clusters have very specific characteristics. Cluster number 1 shows us how we obtain a 3 plus minus by averaging the two extremes. We have some people that say it's a concrete thingy, so 5, and some other people that say it's an abstract thingy, it's a 1. Mid-cluster, semi-property, beautiful, is a 3 and we agree. Of course, I mean, remember those are probabilities, so there's never one versus the rest, but here we're looking at the majority values, majority scores. How about 3? We really have no clues. I say 1, you say 2, you say 3, you say 4, you say 5. So we really see how there is disagreements of two different types. 1 and 3, and the beautiful semi-property in the middle for 2. Why is this important? Well, it's an interesting element, first of all, but also because we should be careful then in how we are dealing with those mid-scale values, because they're clearly showing very different behaviors. And those behaviors seems to be more aligned with how abstract is behaving in a certain way from a property perspective. And from a distributional perspective, so the cluster analysis showed that when we're looking into those values, single entity, single scores, we see that they have different behaviors. And not many people look at those behaviors. You would just say, well, let's just predict. So what computational linguistics in particular is doing right now, let's predict scores from 1 to 5. Everything counts the same. Probably not. So what is somehow our recipe here? Well, in general, we suggest two approaches. One approach is what we often do is to say, okay, mid-scale is even more troubled than the rest. Let's remove it for now. We're not forgetting about this mid-scale, but if we want to characterize clear properties of concrete versus clear properties of abstract, mid-scale is probably not the way to go. So we can just focus on the two extremes. Valid choice. I mean, we are clearly avoiding the elephant in the room, but at least we are not drawing conclusions based on data that is not stable. Or the other option is that I find way more interesting, but way more tricky to somehow really implement, is this idea of fine-tuning and not in a computational way. So it's more like more making the model or even the human aware of the fact that we have these very different types of distributions under the general distribution of concreteness that should be kept under the microscope better. What could be a way? Well, it could be to say, well, instead of treating mid-scale as one element, one umbrella term, let's look at these three different umbrella terms. The semi-properties versus ambiguity versus disagreement are very different concepts and very different ways of dealing with this type of information. This is the end of the first part, and now I would just jump into the multimodality. Do we want to have questions now, or do we get to the very end? At the end, so yeah, cool. So now we survived about looking at some of the possible limitations using those type of norms, and now, in our opinion, we can somehow change slightly the perspective to have a slightly more aware way of dealing with this type of resources. Second part of this presentation instead is the multimodal part. As Mariana said in the introduction, slowly, I'm moving from purely linguistic type of analysis to multimodal type of analysis. All the work with Gabriella is multimodal in a certain way. The work that we're doing here instead is the boring multimodal from a computational linguistics that usually means vision and language. But still, way better than just language. Or well, not way better, but way different in a certain way. So the starting point, again, Good old Brisbane. So this table again comes from the same paper of the norms. And here what they were looking at was the correlation between concreteness and the 5 dimensions that Connell and Lynott described in their perceptual strength rating. Don't be surprised about the 2020 and the 2014, but this kept growing, and this is the most recent version of the resource. Is not a typo here. And what they showed is kind of an interesting phenomenon. So on one side, we see auditory strength. So this is telling us that there is a negative correlation between concreteness and auditory score. So what is auditory? Those type of perceptual elements is like, if I tell you banana, but the word banana or the concept banana, it's always difficult here. What is auditory strength from 1 to 5? Is banana very auditory? Probably not. It's probably not also not silent, but still, because when we are peeling it, for example, it makes a sound, I would guess, but it's also not a loud element. What is the auditory component of whistle? And that's what they did. So on one side, we see a very negative, so a negative correlation with the auditory component. And here, not very surprising. Noise, rumor, speech, all things that are somehow landing on the left-hand side, so toward abstractness. Not all extremely abstract, but still in that area. And on the other side, we have, of course, the strongest positive correlation, vision. So something that is visual is probably also very concrete. Going back to our original definition, again, nothing surprising. They showed this table to strengthen even more the fact that those norms are based on perceptual qualities and characteristics. But then this is exactly the reason why we are like, okay, how about then we look at the visual components? And it's not, of course, because that's the easiest to be annotated and analyzed, but it's more like, just when results support your direction of studies is always a nice thing. So, of course, working with images, it's easier than working with all the other type of inputs. That's the reason why in computational linguistics, we always start there. So after text, images is the stuff that is available the most, and it's easier to analyze. But of course, also visual properties from a human cognitive perspective, it's one of the strongest channels in, on the average subject. So interesting direction probably to take. And this is the work that we did with our ex-PhD student, now he's happy in industry, Tarun Tatar. And the idea here was to look at the visual element, the visual component. So the point again is vision seems to be stronger than the other dimensions. So let's look at vision. However, there is a problem, or well, it's not a problem, it's actually connected to reality. Is the fact that when we're looking at multimodal representations in computational linguistics, most of the time, the linguistic component, the linguistic channel does most of the heavy lifting, and then the visual component just adds that 10% improvement. It's not little improvement, but still, when I have an 80% of language imaging in a classification task, and then I add a 10%, sounds a bit unsatisfactory. And this is, of course, related to many things. It's related to the fact that the linguistic component, the language textual component, is a strong predictor of many of those phenomena, and it contains a lot of information that is useful. And from a modeling perspective, we are also probably better in extracting this information. We're working on it since forever by now. Vision is a more recent type of study. I mean, it's not recent anymore, but still, it became a grown-up adult way later than text. And that still is a problem, though, because the question here was like, okay, but if we always go through the vision and language component, then the linguistic aspect that we studied until now is probably the one doing most of the heavy lifting. How about we try to focus only on vision? So we forget about language now. Of course, the linguistic link is still there because we're dealing with concreteness, and concreteness is a lexical property from a computational perspective. So still linguistics, but on the other side, the channel is only vision. And the general question here is, can visual information alone distinguish between concrete versus abstract? So here we see some examples. And the original idea was, it shouldn't be difficult, right? If you think about images of bananas, they're going to be all more or less the same. If I think about image of justice, as we said, they're going to be probably very messy. So let's focus on abstract. In reality, what became very clear very soon is the fact that even concrete images on the right-hand side are way messier than expected. We have situations like banana, where those are both images of bananas. But if I look at them visually, imagine that I want a model to deal with this information. Not very similar. Waterfalls on the other side seems way more similar, even though, from a concreteness perspective, we are there. Chariot. I don't know if the light here is good enough, but one is a real chariot, the other one is just a little model. Abstract on the other side, way more tricky. So we see representations in even more abstract ways, so cartoon-like ways, links to things that are really not the representation of it. In this case, we have the good old Picard appearing there, so movie information kicking in. We will see the example with The Office, another very clear classical case. Text. Very extreme representations of an abstract element, they're just the written form of it. That's the thing that drove me crazy, because this is not what we want. We want to get rid of text. Comes back. So a lot of visual variability, a lot of variability in informativeness of those images, and missing consistency. And consistency in a certain way is the key element when we want to do anything with this type of resources. So here we just asked 3 research questions. So the first one is, can visual attributes alone differentiate between representation of concrete versus representation of abstract? So can I just classify images as concrete versus abstract based on only their visual properties? Second question, how consistent are those visual attributes? And 3, what are possible failure categories? Why does it go so wrong? I'm already telling you, it's going really wrong. So what we did here was to take 1,000 target nouns, still from Riesbert, highly abstract, highly concrete. So you see here we took clear cases, it's already messy as it is. So we look at the extreme cases, and we download it. So we went to Bing, so search engine, downloading 25 images per target. This is more of a controlled data set, nice and clean data set, very pretty. A lot of bananas that look like bananas. YFCC 100 millions, massive resource using computational linguistics taken from Flickr et al. I mean, you worked a lot with this type of images. Way nicer in terms of variability, but catastrophically more difficult. Super variable, the variability is massive. The quality of those images is also very changing. But what it allowed us to do was to try, at least as much as possible, to collect for each of those targets from 25 up to 500 images. Why? Because there is this idea that if I want to build, in the same way that if I want to build a stable linguistic representation, I need enough occurrences of my target word in many sentences. Here is the same story, even more tricky. So we need more information to build a stable representation of banana from a visual perspective. So in terms of features, we look at 3 different groups, low-level features. So the idea here was like probably colors, probably abstract information, or abstract representations have specific type of colors that concrete don't have. Texture in the image, and edges and shapes. And those features were all automatically extracted from those images. We had classifiers that would just extract colors, extract texture, extract histograms. Same story for high-level features. So objects, scene information, and then patterns and regions. And finally, we also said, well, we are in the era, so I lied a bit. Those are not LLMs, but they're still larger models. Those are just state-of-the-art, state-of-the-art VIT in particular models back then, that they would just say, you take an image and I give you an output, a vector representation of this image. Everything's smashed together, and in theory, even more information than the one that we're capturing with simpler properties. It's basically running a word embedding, so a word fast text model, but in the visual space. And this is an idea of how those images would look like if we were just superimposing the properties that we extracted. Is an image of a mule. So what does it mean to be an image of a mule? Well, it means that this image was tagged with the label mule. And those are, yeah, some people are already looking at me a bit perplexed. Yeah, there are mules in here, but still, that's also one of the characteristics that make this task more difficult. How do you find good images? So the first study is just to say, can we identify features that are the most useful to classify concrete versus abstract? We use a bunch of classifiers. Random forest seems to be the one that works the best, just an architectural reason. And then what we did in terms of features, we look at individual features and combined features. Results, sorry for the massive metric. So here, this metric shows us F1 scores. So it's a classification task, basically how well does the classifier says that this is concrete when. Y-axis, we see the different features independently and then combine the basic, our two complex neural models, and then combination of the neural models plus other features. And finally, they combine everything together. Column, so x-axis, we see number of images per target, 25 from Bing, first column, 25 up to 500 for y-axis. So what do we see here? Well, first column, darker than the rest. So it seems that those 25 more, well, cleaner type of representations in general seem to be a better way to capture this distinction than way larger on the side, but also way more noisy type of representations. You know, average noise with noise doesn't give you much more than noise. Of course, there is signal that hopefully is still there, but that's the issue. What is the other interesting aspect is that that low-level features, that what happened up at the top here, seem to be the one, you see, that behave the best compared to more complex type of models. This was kind of an interesting result in the era where neural networks do everything. It seems that simpler features are doing their own good share without the need of employing more complex type of models. So it only gets slightly outperform 83 up to 85 when I'm combining simpler feature with most complex features, but is even a 0.02 improvement even worth discussing here. And in general, yes, the fact that these neural models seem to struggle the most is also kind of interesting to see. Here, what we did was to break it down. So let's look now at images only of abstract and images only of concrete. So if we compare the two, so it's the same results as before, but now we just broke down the metric into right-hand side concrete darker than left. So clearly seems easier to detect, to classify a concrete concept, an image of a concrete concept as concrete than an image of an abstract concept as abstract. Again, what we see is that Bing is doing quite some good stuff. YFCC instead, what it shows is this interesting element that in reality, by increasing the number of images for each target, for concrete elements, it improves. For abstracts, it actually is detrimental. Two reasons here, and we cannot really break it down. We have to be transparent. One option, and that's the more hoping option, is the fact that in a certain way, as we said, concrete representation, so representation of concrete items should be more consistent on a large level. So by going up to 500, we are basically trying to identify all the common aspects. And the model basically has learned very well how a banana looks like. The more pessimistic view on it is data sparsity. Because what's the problem with abstract representation is that you don't find images for them. So you find 25 images of justice. You don't find, and I don't know if it's true for justice, but in general, you don't find 500 images for justice. So that's also one problem that in a certain way here we see, and you can see it in the paper, the distribution of the coverage of our images drops over time. So this is somehow a caveat that we should keep in mind when analyzing data. But in general, we see how it's doing an okay job, but clearly there is a preference. Second study that was the most interesting also from a general contribution in the field, computational linguistics or vision in this case, is this assumption that, well, if we want to build stable representations of bananas, we would want to have images that are consistent, that are similar enough that I'm not adding noise to noise. So what we did here was to say, okay, let's now analyze our data. Let's try now to take all those vectors for all our targets. So I take for all our images, and now we do nearest neighbors. Imagine that now we have a space that is massive, because for each of those images we have, I don't remember how many instances of images of bananas. What were we expecting here was that if I'm then computing, identifying nearest neighbors, saying what are the images that are the most similar to each other, we would expect them to be more similar. So if I have images of bananas, they should be all neighbors of each other. That was the positive thinking, right? And here we see our results. So this table shows some interesting numbers. Sorry for bombarding you with numbers here. But the sad story is that those are percentages. There's nothing else, they're not probabilities because they go above one. So what does this mean? It means that if I'm trying to look at, if I build a vector based on the colors of this image, and now I'm trying to look at the neighbors of all those visual representations only based on these color representations, 0.68% of the time, the same the images of the same target are neighbors of each other. Meaning, this is not exactly how to interpret it, but imagine that only 0.68% of the times, if I have the image of a banana, the visual neighbors of this image of a banana are also images of a banana. Quite terrifying, because this means, from a very general perspective, that what we are averaging is really a lot of noise. Because the assumption is that we are averaging something that visually should be comparable over the big distribution. In reality, it seems to be extremely tricky. Of course, even more tricky for abstract, not surprising, but for concrete. And remember that all those visual models that deal with representation, usually they focus on concrete representations for obvious reasons. Still, massive issues. Just to look a bit at the positive side, so it seems that higher level features here help a bit more, in particular for concrete. So YOLO, so object detection. 3 images of bananas are neighbors of bananas. VIT, 3%, sorry, and VIT, 26% of images of bananas are bananas, meaning that in this case, really using models that capture richer representations seem to be the way to get something that is a bit more reasonable, still 26%. So in general, massive problem. So be careful about using this. And now, last point before Mariana shoots at me, the study 3 is just exploring, I don't know when we started, sorry about that, I lost track of it, is exploring why it's so catastrophic. So here what we looked at is basically the diversity of those images. And Tagon did a very nice analysis here. So he started looking in a very qualitative way into those images and started seeing very clear patterns on why it goes so wrong. And here we see very interesting aspects. So we see on one side, classical ambiguity, even from a visual perspective. The top one is accuracy in the computational sense. The lower one is just accuracy. Just like throwing a dart and precise. Same idea, but very different way of presenting it. Physical context, same banana. Very different situations. We said, I mean, there is probability playing a role, but still, it's expected to grow on a tree. It is expected to be probably on a out of context imaginary table. Subjective descriptions, those are super nice examples. How do we differently describe equality? Some people focus more on skin color. Some people would instead focus on male-female balance. See, very different ways. Not that one is wrong and the other one is right. Just different ways of representing the same type of concept. Pop culture. This was the Picard example. The Office and Office. Imagine averaging together the representations here. And finally, the classical, lack of visual representations, a lot of text that happens in there. So in general, this was, a paper that was expecting some positive results. In reality, we saw a lot of negative results that we still believe are important for the community because they show us, we started by looking at this classification point on low-level features. And we saw how images improve performance, but only at the completeness level. We said it's darker in that direction. Concrete and abstract targets also show significant visual variability, and this is a crucial element in there. And then we showed in study 3 why possible it is. So key takeaways. In this talk, I just discussed 2 major aspects. On one side, some issues that can emerge when dealing with those norms. In particular, we look at distributions, by part of speech, and misscale values. And then the second study, the second part of the presentation that looks at visual representations. So thank you again for listening. Sorry for dragging it so long. And a big thanks to the collaborators. So, well, Sabine, with 11 years that we're working on this topic, and now we have fun with it. And then our 2 PhD students, Tagon on the vision, and Urban that now is doing a PhD focusing more on the multilingual type of component. And thanks for listening. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Diego, for such a rich seminar. I think we can stop the recording and we can thank all of the participants.
Thank you so much.
Speaker. And the seminar, see you for the next seminar of abstraction. There will be information in due course, and this seminar will be posted on the abstraction portal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.